a very warm welcome to you as we connect across different geographical, disciplinary, and social locations. We are delighted to have had an astonishing 2,500 participants register for this webinar on the psychology of racism in light of the Black Lives Matter movement. As it stands, I think it looks like we have close to 1,000 people who have joined us already. And looking at the chats coming through, lighting up, I see friends joining us from the US, Brazil, Colombia, Singapore, the UK, did I say Canada? And I'm sure lots more places across the world. So a very warm welcome to you again. This conversation is co-hosted by the Psychological Society of South Africa and the Institute for Social and Health Sciences at the University of South Africa. A quick word about the co-hosts. PsySSA, as those of you who are PsySSA members would know, has dedicated much of its work to the construction and development of post-1994 South African society. Its work is very much focused on advancing South African psychology on the continent as a science and as a profession of global stature to promote psychological practices as relevant, as proactive, and is responsive to the social needs of well-being of the citizenry. The co-host, the Institute for Social and Health Sciences, is an Africa-centered, community-engaged, transdisciplinary entity in the social and health sciences. Its work focuses very much on liberatory scholarship and activism in the service of human development. So we thank the co-hosts, PsySSA, and the Institute for Social and Health Sciences for organizing this webinar. Again, you would have probably seen on the chat that people are looking forward to the conversation, welcoming the timing of the conversation. Are excited, obviously, for a number of reasons, given the centrality of this conversation in this particular moment. As we know, the recent acts of anti-Black racism, both in their extraordinary but also in their everyday manifestations of what really is treated as the disposability of Black lives, this has ignited but also reignited really, really important conversations on systemic racism, as well as old and new rebellions against racial oppression and white supremacy in South Africa and, of course, across the world. You will also probably agree with me that these rebellions represent a very, very important, a seminal moment in the politics of liberation, and certainly for some of us on the psychopolitics liberation, raising yet again, as was the case in South Africa prior to 1994, deeply fundamental questions about the psychology of racism and, of course, psychology's ultimate will to address racism. Over the last many years, South Africa has produced several psychologists who have devoted their intellectual labor, their practice, their activism to understanding and fighting racism in psychology and in society, as well as making psychology anti-racist. In 1994, with the birth of what was meant to be a truly non-racial, a truly non-sexist and egalitarian society, many anti-racists and as well as other progressive psychologists in the country here in South Africa, not unlike anti-apartheid activists and progressive scholars from other disciplines and from other contexts, apparently felt that racism was dead. In some way, it was dead, at least in this country. Needless to say, we were naive. Of course, that sounds quite incredulous now. And we were naive. For many, very many reasons then, this webinar, this conversation is a necessary one. It's a necessary one in the context of the current multiple and interlocking crises that we are facing here in South Africa, but also across the world, as we certainly in the discipline of psychology are tested to once more confront matters of complicity, matters of silence, and then in the context of the broader call to recommit to commit and to recommit imaginations, to the consciousness, to the actions, and to the solidarities that support movement towards the kinds of changes that we wish to see. So on the panel today, we are extremely privileged to have three leading psychologists who work on race, racism, patriarchy, sexuality, class, and violence. Professors Stevens, Kessi, and Ratele will offer their insights on how we are to understand racism today in the country and, of course, elsewhere too. Interrogating the possibilities as well as the challenges of overcoming racism, locally, globally, in daily life, in our respective contexts, at universities, at work, in other environments. And the reflections on the past as well as the futures of racism take place very much in the shadow of the murders of George Floyd in the United States, as we know, and of Collins Kosa here in South Africa, but also the hope that's been ushered in by the sustained protests that we've seen being led by the Black Lives Matter campaign and also similar movements here in South Africa and other parts of the world. Finally, the discussion will interrogate the causes and the new shapes that racism has taken in the country, bringing into conversation different forms of racism, including scientific, institutional, and interpersonal racisms, and their intersections with sexisms, nationalisms, and anti-poor structures and policies. So we certainly have a very, very exciting 2 hours, more or less 2 hours ahead of us. Once again, a warm welcome. Before I introduce the panelists, I have the job of sharing a few housekeeping rules from us. I think at this point we're all fairly familiar with the protocol around muting ourselves unless we are talking. But besides that, I want to bring your attention to CPDs, the matter of CPD certificates. All attendees who require CPD certificate, and this is for the 2 general CEU points that you will be receiving based on your participation. You are to please complete the webinar information evaluation form. The link to this form will be shared in the chat function in the closing minutes of the webinar. A second point that I'd like to bring to your attention is the matter of the SAJP. SAJP is the South African Journal of Psychology, has initiated a racism commentary series. And within this series, a number of editorials will appear in an upcoming volume, which will be released either at the end of August or the beginning of September. However, the editorship of the SAJP will be doing a rapid publication series. So we hope to have that available on the PsySSA website very soon. You will be notified. Many of you have asked about the recording of this webinar. Yes, there will be a recording, and hopefully by next week, the recording will be posted to PsySSA's YouTube channel. Finally, a list of references on articles published in the SAJP on race have been uploaded to the PsySSA website. You will find these at Newsroom, and if you then click on Publications and SAJP, you should be able to access that list. I would now like to ask our panelists to please switch on their camera, able to do that. And yeah, thank you, thank you. Professor Ratele, while we're waiting for Professor Ratele's camera to connect him to us visually, I will start to introduce our panelists. Admin, can you assist in this webinar? Professor Stevens, who will be our first speaker, is the Dean of Humanities. Professor Stevens is also a clinical psychologist in the Department of Psychology in the School of Human and Community Development at the University of the Witwatersrand here in South Africa. His research interests are many, and certainly include a focus on race and racism and related social asymmetries. I should add that Professor Stevens is currently serving as the president of the Psychological Society of South Africa. Professor Ratele, the camera's been sorted out. Thank you. Shose Kessi is Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cape Town here in South Africa. She is a social psychologist with research interests in decolonial approaches to the study of racial and gender identities. Her work focuses on engaging individuals and groups through photo voices. And finally, Kopano Ratele is the director of the South African Medical Research Council's Masculinity and Health Research Unit and professor at the University of South Africa, where he runs the Transdisciplinary African Psychologies program. His research interests are also many and include a focus on masculinity, race and racism, violence, and African-centered decolonizing and cultural psychology. Kopano is a member of the Ministerial Committee on Transformation in South African Universities, a former president of the Psychological Society of South Africa, and former chairperson of Sonke Gender Justice. With that, I believe I should pause and hand over to Professor Stevens. The rest of us will switch off our cameras at this point. Professor Stevens, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shanaz. Can you all hear me? Great, that's excellent. You let me know if there are problems on the sound at some point. I can see your comments at the bottom, so please just do let me know if there are connectivity issues at any point in time. I just want to firstly start by saying thank you to Shanaz for the warm introduction, also to UNISA and also to the Psychological Society of South Africa for allowing me to be part of this really important webinar today, this conversation today. And I've been allocated about 15 minutes or so, give or take, to really just try to frame some of our conversations around the psychology of race and in the context of Black Lives Matter today. So I've decided that what I really want to do over the next 15 minutes or so is really speak to two questions and then to offer two provocations associated with those two questions and at the end of these two questions. And the two questions are effectively as follows. The first is why it is that race continues to matter as a subject and as an object of social inquiry today. And I'm fascinated by the numbers of people who have signed up to attend this webinar. And it's very clear to me that in fact, race continues to have a valence and a currency that is really, really important, not only in South Africa, given its racialized history, but certainly across the world. The second question that I really want to speak about thereafter is really just to kind of frame some of why it is that psychology continues to be an important site for thinking about race, racism, and related social asymmetries, given the fact that this, of course, is a vexing social and a political problem, but of course is also a deeply psychosocial and psychopolitical problem that needs to be attended to in some way. So in coming to the first question and really asking why it is that race continues to matter today, I suppose the simple answer to the question is the nature of context. And here I want to talk about multiple contexts and the way that these multiple contexts continue to shape our lives today. The first really being a reflection on the kinds of turns that we see globally at the moment to a deep, deep neoconservatism. And the neoconservative turn that I'm of course talking about is a conservative turn that sees the likes of the leadership of Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, and of course Jair Bolsonaro, to mention but a few, who continue to articulate a sense of a hierarchy of life, and that the value of life is differently distributed across people depending on the color of their skin. And one sees this, of course, in a whole range of issues related to Islamophobia and increasing anti-immigrant sentiments, and of course, anti-Black racism that Shose has been referring to. In a country like South Africa, of course, one also sees that the politics of race is a compulsively repeated manifestation on our landscape. And this is not only in the post-1994 period, but of course has a very lengthy history prior to this. What is important today, though, is that much of social life in South Africa continues to be racialized. And when I say this, I talk about everything from the nature of service delivery protests, to those elements of xenophobia, to the increasing preponderance of racialized science. In the recent years, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a number of scientific publications emerging from universities, in particular, really speaking about the either the cognitive deficits of women of color, or the intellectual competence of slaves historically, or in fact the choices that Black students make in relation to conservation sciences in contemporary South Africa. Of course, we also continue to see things like crime, violence, health, etc. All of these matters tend to be racialized in a country like South Africa. And if one looks at the last 100 years, just as for a cursory review, I think one sees this kind of repetition of race throughout the social landscape. If one looks back at the early 20th century, of course, there was a moment when scientific racism was certainly on the ascendancy. And what we saw in response to this, a resistance to this, was in fact forms of multiracialism and of course Black nationalism emerging in the early 1900s. By the time we hit the 1930s and the 1940s, of course, institutionalized racism had very much become the order of the day. And then, of course, one starts to see a whole range of resistances, and these resistances are, of course, in the form of non-racialism in particular brands of non-racialism, but also notions of the boycott and non-collaboration. By the 1960s, the 1970s, and even into the early 1980s, of course, race becomes much more clearly connected to issues of identity politics, culture, and so on. And in response to this, one sees elements of Pan-Africanism, and one sees elements of Black consciousness emerging in that time. If I were to jump forward then, of course, to the post-1994 period, I think what has to be recognized here is that the post-1994 period, after the initial carnivalesque moment of the transition to democracy, of course, I think we have to recognize the failures to attend to race historically. And of course, this is complicated now by elements of both overt racism as well as the concealment of race, by different modes of ethno-nationalism. And of course, as a response, race increasingly now is connected to social struggles around material inequality, poverty, landlessness, but also race is connected to an experience of being in the world. In other words, race and much of the politics of race has been connected to a kind of metaphysics of race. The point that I'm really trying to make in this cursory commentary about the history of context here is that race and resistance is, of course, compulsively repeated in a country like South Africa. But beyond this, I think it's important to recognize that actually some of the questions that we asked in the post-1994 period were not that useful. We started to ask questions about the extent to which we could mediate and attenuate the legacies of racism in South Africa. What we were not asking were questions about the virulence of race, its ability to morph, its ability to become sustained, and its recalcitrance in post-apartheid South Africa, and indeed its elasticity. This, of course, has been even further complicated by COVID-19. And I think it's incumbent upon us to say something about COVID-19, because, of course, while COVID-19 as a disease, as a contagion, is indiscriminate, We know that there are racial disparities in the social epidemiology of disease, and of course the consequences of things, everything from disease transmission to lockdown and to the social sequelae of disease. This has illuminated the kind of racial disparities even further in a country like South Africa. Now, in the context of a social movement like Black Lives Matter and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, because of course Black Lives Matter is not new, but certainly the resurgence of Black Lives Matter across the globe, what has been fascinating to see is the kind of traction that it has received in many parts of the world today. Of course, we were all horrified by essentially the murder of George Floyd on television, of the death of Collins Khoza in South Africa. And I do want to make the point, though, that even though Black Lives Matter has received the kind of traction that it has in the world today, for decades, many outside of the USA, of course, have been deeply troubled and concerned about Black Lives Matter, and of course about the expendability of Black lives in other parts of the world beyond the USA. So in response to my first question, I really want to end my first question with two provocations. And the first is a question about the repetition of race and the resistance to race, because it seems to me, and I'm very thankful to my colleague Peace Kiguwa for having a conversation with me recently, precisely on this matter. Because if race and resistance to race is so compulsively repeated, the question is whether we are not engaged in the politics of repetitive recognition. In other words, are we involved in a politics to be seen and valued repeatedly? And are we not doomed to such a repetition? And I asked the question, and when I asked the question, of course, it brings me to a famous quote by Dorothy Roberts, who, of course, makes the point that race is not a biological category that is politicized. In fact, it is a deeply political category that is often disguised as a biological one, and has been so since the earliest debates on what it means to be human. And I raise this because my first provocation here is really to ask the question whether part of an anti-racist project should not also be focusing on what it means to be human beyond a politics of recognition. The second provocation that emerges from this, of course, is a question about Black Lives Matter. And I do want to be provocative about this because, of course, Black Lives Matter has activated a sense of the importance of valuing Black lives across the world. But of course, Black lives have been disposable for many, many centuries. And so the question that I suppose I'm wanting to pose today is why it is that we still need to use a northern reference when we think about the expendability and the disposability of Black lives in the global south. What is it about our referencing to the global north when we are located in the global south, and how can we rethink this particular project? My second question, and I'm just looking at my time. Shanaz, do you want to give me an indication of my time?
Garth, Professor Stevens, can you hear me?
Yes.
You have some more time. Please go on.
Okay, thank you. So the second point that I'd really, or question that I'd like to attend to, other than the kind of question about context and why it is that context shapes the valence and the currency of race in this particular moment, of course, is related to psychology itself as a discipline, as a mode of practice, as a site of training, and so on. And I'm wanting to think a little bit and to talk a little bit about psychology's contribution to the vexing psychopolitical and psychosocial matter of race today. I think it's, again, I think it would be appropriate to, first of all, reflect. And I wanted to take a snapshot of South African psychology. So I'm not going to look at global psychology, but certainly in the context of South African psychology, I think one has to think through initially what psychology's complicity has been in the maintenance and the reproduction of racism and related social asymmetries. So, of course, we can think about psychology as a political and certainly as a biopolitical technology. And from the earliest days of its introduction in South Africa, of course, it was implicated in mental testing, in mining and the early forms of industrialization in South Africa in the early 20th century, certainly. It was also central to much of the work of the Carnegie Commission in the 1920s. And of course, we all know that the Carnegie Commission of the 1920s, in which it was attempting to deal with the poor white problem, was really the precursor for much of what was going to be set down in the kinds of policies that laid the groundwork for the 1948 transition to institutionalized racism in the form of apartheid. I think it also has to be said that in this time, organized psychology was very much part and parcel of the reproduction and maintenance of this for something like over 70 years. And so psychology itself has a very distinctive history that has not been particularly positive in the context of addressing race and racism in a country like South Africa. That being said, though, I think it is important to note that, of course, psychology has also made a contribution, a significant contribution to understanding the nature of race, the mechanics of race, and the way that racism and related social asymmetries actually unfold and play themselves out. And of course, I don't want to turn this into a kind of recovery of all of that work, but I do want to make a few points about psychology's contribution and why it is that as a lens and as a site, it still holds particular kinds of promise today. From its earliest work, of course, many of you will be familiar with the fact that psychology was interested in understanding race through the lenses of things like the authoritarian personality. Of course, it did a huge amount of work and continues to do a huge amount of work in the area of race attitudes and attitudinal shifts. That was also connected to work on prejudice, which was really the mainstay of much of the mainstream of psychological research at some point. At some time, there was also a move towards understanding race in the context of conflict. And of course, there we looked at everything from realistic conflict theory to relative deprivation theory and so on. But increasingly, of course, we started to move away from the idea of individual attributes that were directing elements of race and racism to thinking about race and racism in the context of groups. And here we did work on ethnocentrism. And of course, that translated into work in the 1970s, certainly on social identity theory and social representation theory. By the 1980s, certainly we started to see a big shift towards post-structuralism. We increasingly started to do work in discourse analysis. And of course, many of you today will know that this is the kind of work that we think about as critical psychology. But of course, critical psychology opened up a whole range of other areas for us to think about. It opened us up areas to think around critical race studies of blackness, critical race studies of whiteness, intersectionality and the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, particularly focusing on gender and black feminism. And then more recently, of course, work in the decolonial turn and the affective turn. The decolonial turn really looking at many of the writers from the Caribbean and from Latin America, Sylvia Wynter, Walter Mignolo, Nelson Maldonado Torres, etc., all doing work on power, being, and the nature of knowledge. And then increasingly also work on the affective turn, and the affective turn here being in some ways connected to work on shame, rage, envy, guilt, melancholia, and also in psychology, seeing a kind of resurgence of work on the psychoanalysis of racism, a return to the work of people like Fakhri David, and a whole range of scholars now starting to think again about psychoanalysis, the normative unconscious, pre-conscious ideas, and so on, related to racism as manifested as part of the unconscious. Again, the point I think I'm wanting to make here is that psychology's approach to race and racism, of course, has taken a number of forms. In the initial years, often thinking through the use of mainstream theory to show the kinds of effects of race and racism. At a later point, really to think about mainstream theory to offer alternative interpretations that were often racialized in some way or another. And then, of course, in the later years, to think much more carefully about transcendence and rupture, to work in cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary ways, certainly to recover the work of people like Fanon, to think about the work of Chobani Mangani, who, for those of you who are not familiar with Mangani's work, wrote a seminal text called Being Black in the World in the 1970s that has just been republished. These were ideas, of course, that were in circulation at the time, and certainly much of the more recent work has been to recover and to recuperate some of this and to integrate this with new knowledges that come from the global south. I want to kind of end off my few minutes of input here with, again, two additional provocations for the second question. The first is that even if we did all this work theoretically over the course of many, many decades, there is a question about theory and whether, in fact, we have not perhaps underestimated the elasticity and the virulence of race and its ability to shapeshift. This was a term that we used in the brief of this particular webinar. And what is it about our theoretical orientations that have not allowed us to stay abreast of how it is that race continues to be underestimated in its ability to virulently and recalcitrantly re-emerge generation after generation in one form or another. The second, of course, is a question related to the politics of affect and experience in this particular moment. And I say this because, of course, our national politics has in some ways been shaped by a new kind of discourse, a discourse that is connected to an experience of race in the world, a phenomenology of that experience of race in the world. And so the question that I'm wanting to pose again as part of the conversation today is, why is it that the politics of affect and experience have gained such attraction today, as opposed to, for example, a politics that is much more connected to race and its relationship to inequality? I think it's an important way to think about race, and I'm not suggesting that the politics of affect and emotion should not be undertaken, but I do think it's important for us to understand why it is that this particular mode of resistance is something that emerges at this particular point in time in a country like South Africa, but also, of course, in other parts of the world. So Shanaz, I think I'm probably over my 15 minutes at this point, and I'm going to hand back to you.
Garth, Shanaz has just lost some connection. If you can just carry on, and then she'll try and establish connection again.
Thanks, Fatima. So I think that maybe at this point, what I should probably do while Shanaz is trying to reconnect, and apologies to all of you, these are the vagaries of working virtually, and I suppose in a world that is reliant on technology. But I think that at this point, what is probably more useful for us to do is to turn our attention to Professor Shose Kessi, who, as has already been indicated, is the current Dean of Humanities at the University of Cape Town. And Shose, I'm going to ask you to perhaps share your thoughts in the next 15 or 20 minutes. I know you have particular ideas on the way that race plays itself out in the context of organizations and in institutional forms today. And so I'm going to ask that you perhaps come in at this point and share your thoughts for the next 15 or 20 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Garth. And good afternoon to everyone. I hope you can hear me. I want to just say a quick thank you to the organizers for putting together this webinar and for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here, and welcome to my home in Cape Town. I want to pick up on some of the issues that were raised by Professor Stevens, and I'm going to talk specifically about institutional racism and give a kind of case study or some examples from my own research. And I think it will carry forward those two questions that Professor Stevens left us with. So institutional racism, I think it's something that's very present in people's minds at the moment. And in many ways, it's at the center of anti-racism movements. We've seen with the Black Lives Movement how the whole issue of institutional racism in the police force was kind of the driving force behind that movement. Here in South Africa, at the University of Cape Town, we saw Roads Must Fall, and that was very much centered around calling out institutional racism in higher education institutions. And there are also a lot of many anti-racism strategies in institutions, such as affirmative action policies and programs that are designed to empower Black people in institutions, which are directly linked to transforming racial demographics. So in other words, addressing the institutional racism of institutions. And these are very much often contested areas of debate and discussion. And I want to try and give some thoughts about what the importance of a psychological lens is in terms of grappling with these issues. So just to, as a starting point, maybe to say something about what I mean when I'm talking about institutional racism. And so institutions are organizations, but it's also a term that's much broader than referring to a specific organization. So it can be an organization like a school or a corporation, but it's also a social structure. And like often people talk about the institution of marriage. So it's also a social structure. And why this is important is because we need to understand institutions as structures that order and govern people's behavior. And they also espouse a set of values, of ideologies and practices that we adhere to, and that also shape our beliefs and behaviors. So in many ways, institutions are foundational to how we organize ourselves as people and how we relate to each other, how we cooperate, how we disagree. And so they are somewhat of a natural function of human society and human organization. Institutions are also reflections of society. So given our history of slavery, colonization, and apartheid, it's no surprise that we are confronted with issues of institutional racism, especially in a rapidly changing society like South Africa. So our institutions are a reflection of the society that we live in and the legacies of the past. So just as institutions can be spaces of cooperation and inclusion, they are also spaces of exclusion. And this is where psychology becomes important, because to understand how institutions are shaped by people and how in turn they shape people, how people behave, what they think, how they include and exclude, and how institutions are also productive, but at the same time discriminatory. So when we use this psychological lens to understand institutions, we can see that addressing institutional racism is not simply about changing the demographics of people in an organization. And this is often a solution that's, it's often the first solution that's provided and that's spoken about. And it's certainly very important to do that, and it's very necessary. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it's not sufficient, because changing individuals does not necessarily change some of the deep-seated ideas, values, and beliefs that exist in institutions. It does not necessarily change very established practices in institutions. So when we speak, for instance, of police brutality, the police are not necessarily white policemen or white policewomen, right? So the change that needs to happen is beyond the individual demographic changes. Also, often we hear employers talk about, diversity training as a response to institutional racism. And here again, there might be some good to these programs and learning about different cultures and changing people's attitudes. but there's also the risk that these types of programs, what they do might be teaching us to be politically correct rather than instituting systemic change. So here again, psychology, I think, is important because it can help us understand how racism functions at different levels of analysis, and Garth took us through some of those levels. So the individual, how we understand it at the level of the individual, the prejudicial attitudes, at the level of groups, or why people might discriminate against others from a different group, and at the level of the socials, really trying to understand how does systemic racism perpetuate itself. And I think this is probably the most difficult aspect of racism to understand, because it's about how is it embedded in institutional structures and cultures. So I think against that kind of background, I want to talk specifically about academic institutions and illustrate what is meant by institutional racism, how complex it is, how it operates at multiple layers, how it intersects with different forms of discrimination. And what I'll try to show in my presentation is therefore that to address institutional racism, we do need a multi-layered, multi-pronged strategy that cuts across all these different levels of analyses. So I did some research with Black students at the University of Cape Town some years ago. And I want to just speak to some of the findings from that research in terms of examples of how institutional racism plays itself out. And I think I've already spoken a bit about the issue of demographics and the need for demographic representation in institutions. We've seen multiple reports, one that just came out recently about the lack of Black professors in universities, and this is something that's very important to address. But it's not only important for employment equity considerations, so there's also a very important symbolic aspect. And what I came across in my study is that students would often say that, they don't see themselves in their professors because they don't have Black professors. They don't see themselves in academic positions, for instance. So in that kind of context, we can see how students are much less likely to believe that they can be a professor one day. And so there's this symbolic barrier to academic, to access to academic institutions, in addition to the material barriers. And this is also a form of institutional racism. So what I'm arguing here, I guess, is that the demographic issue has a psychological impact beyond the material impact, right? And that this lack of representation impacts on how people think and what people value and their sense of belonging in the institutions they find themselves in. The second issue is the issue of space. And in my study, students raised issues of symbols and artworks across campus. And this was also, as we know, a central element of the Rhodes Must Fall movement and around the discussion around the statue of Cecil John Rhodes. And this has actually traveled across the world with many statues falling in different places across the world. So it's this being confronted with images of oppressors on a daily basis can have a profound impact on the psyche. And it's not just about seeing the images, but it's also about how they are valued and revered in the space, in the institution itself, which in turn can devalue people's experiences of oppression. And this can be quite a traumatic experience. Psychologists often refer to this as historical trauma. And I guess to explain what I mean by that, I would say that, young people today may have not experienced apartheid, but we all know about it. They might have parents or grandparents or family members who have, and who they would have been told stories. And these are stories of trauma. And so when you're in a space where you're confronted with that, with those images, these experiences of trauma can be evoked and play themselves out in these institutions. So, and often students also spoke about how Black people are actually represented in artworks across campus. They spoke about how there's an overrepresentation of nakedness in the images of Black people, or an overrepresentations of poverty, right? So reinforcing these stigmatizing images of Black people and alienating experiences. In fact, Kopano and I have a student at the moment who's doing some really interesting research on race and space in a university campus. And without wanting to reveal too much about her study, there was a very interesting finding about how certain students are more familiar to the university space. So if you come from a family where your parents have been to university, or your parents work in a university, or you live in the same neighborhood as the university, you will be more comfortable in that space because they would have developed a certain familiarity with the space and its values. And so by the time you get to university, your experience will be very different from somebody who has no experience of the university at all. So all of these things kind of merge together in a transforming institutional space. And you can see that from these examples, how students might feel alienated and excluded from an environment in which they're expected to learn. And this has had a direct impact on academic achievement. Then there's the issue of curriculum and pedagogical practices. So the students in my study also often spoke about how they were unable to relate to the content of the materials in the curriculum. And this is not just about the fact that they were learning new ideas and concepts, but rather that their cultural experiences were not represented in materials such as textbooks. They spoke about the Eurocentric focus of the curriculum and how Africans are often represented in their textbooks or materials in stigmatizing ways. They also spoke about teaching practices and how, because of the lack of representation, they did not feel able to always participate in classroom discussions. So, and when they did participate, they had experiences of being ridiculed by other students, as well as their teachers. As a result of this, Black students tended to silence themselves. And you know, when people silence themselves, it can be understood also in a racializing way, as not able to contribute. So reproducing certain stereotypical images. One issue that came up a lot was the question of group work, because in academic institutions, students are often asked to do group work with other students. And Black students often said that their contributions to group work were overly scrutinized by their peers, or that they were never asked to lead a group or contribute anything significant to the group work. So all of these experiences contribute to creating a particular experience for Black students that has an impact on their self-esteem and ability to perform academically. I think language is also a very important issue here, and I don't want to say too much about language because it could be a whole presentation in itself. But just to bear in mind that we have in institutions, higher education institutions here, which are predominantly in English, there's a number of students whose language mother tongue is not English. And that contributes to creating a particular experience of the university. And I guess the final area I wanted to touch upon is around leadership and decision-making. And I think just also from my personal experience and from experiences of other Black academics in higher education institutions, there are many similar experiences to the ones I've just spoken about, such as being overly scrutinized in appointment processes or in promotion processes, the lack of representation on committees or in senior positions. These are just some of these examples. So all of these examples are examples of how institutional racism operates in multiple overlapping and intersecting ways in an organization, and the psychological impact, which can be very serious. We have seen in recent years, particularly since 2015, we've seen high levels of anxiety and depression amongst students and the general academic community. And because these experiences of exclusion and alienation are often internalized and therefore can have very material impact on academic performances, with many students actually ending up dropping out. So just from these examples, I think we need to think about the fact that institutional racism requires a deep investigation into complex and intricate processes of institutions, their values, and how they are reproduced by people within these institutions. And I think what we can learn from Rose Must Fall and what we can learn from the Black Lives Matter movement is that this struggle against institutional racism is beyond an individual institution. Because racism exists in our society, broadly speaking, institutions can't change on their own. And there also needs to be, they need to be a part of a broad-based movement for change. And this is very difficult to achieve. And it's difficult to achieve within an institution itself. And for example, from my study, I found that Black students would also distance themselves from anti-racism strategies. And so when we talked about affirmative action, students would distance themselves and say things like, yes, affirmative action is very important, but it doesn't have anything to do with me. I got into the university because I had very good marks. And these are ways in which they are protecting their identities as Black students. They don't want to see themselves as being oppressed or being marginalized. They don't want to perpetuate images of victimhood, which can also reproduce disadvantage and solidify stereotypes. So these are questions I think that Professor Stevens raised, and I think need a lot more thought. And perhaps this is where we need to pay more attention as psychologists doing research into racism. Also, Black people in positions of power may also reproduce institutional racism because they need to protect themselves and to protect their newly found privileged status. So there's the possibilities and difficulties in mobilizing against racism are complex. And I think that psychologists, we need to extend the study of Blackness in order to understand what these possibilities and difficulties are. We need to understand how Blackness intersects with other identities. We need to ask questions about who is marginalized, who is oppressed, and do we have to understand these terms in this deficit discourse? I think we need to pay more attention to the politics of emotion. So how do we, for instance, talk about Black pain without having to perform poverty and perform victimization? So those are just some thoughts, and I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. And Shanaz, I don't know if you're back online, but I'm ready to hand over.
Shose, thank you so much. Colleagues, participants, friends, comrades, we are having some connectivity problems with Professor Safla, and so she's simply asked that we roll with it, and we continue to think about how it is that we can have this conversation, and she will try to get back into this. Shose, thank you so much for the presentation, thinking through space, leadership, decision making, student experiences and staff experiences inside institutions today. So that is really wonderful, and I hope that we can connect some of the dots in the conversation hereafter. I'm going to go straight to Professor Kopano Ratele. Kopano, I think we're going to give you your allotted 20 minutes. I suspect that we've all been somewhat out of the lane as far as time is concerned here. But if I can turn it over to you at this point, Kopano, just for your thoughts on psychology, anti-racist praxis, and what does the future look like for us when we think about anti-racist praxis and the possibilities thereof. So thanks.
Thanks, Garth. Can I ask Fatima Mohammed to enable the screen sharing tool there?
Kopano, just give me a minute. I'm doing that for you now.
You want to share the screen?
Yeah. Kopano, just click share screen on your computer on the side button.
I have, it's disabled. Do let me know and I will begin in the meantime.
Okay, perfect.
Well, I also want to extend my thanks to the Psychological Society of South Africa, Fatima, the people in the office. And today is an amazing one because two presidents, one an incoming president, Shose, who's having problems right now, and Garth Stevens, who's the current president, are part of this webinar series. So thanks to both of you and the executive and the rest of the executive and council at PsySSA. I also want to thank the institute, the UNISA Institute for Social and Health Sciences at UNISA. I want to begin by telling you, while Fatima is trying to help me.
Kopano, it's correct. You can share it. It's done.
Wonderful. I want to begin by telling you that what I'm going to talk about today is not the result of my fantastic mind. It's out of the dialogues and deliberations with a lot of people, my colleagues, and my students, and a number of other people. I've mentioned some of them who are accompanying here. Ikmal Herbesh, Naz Sofla, whom you've seen, Siput Lameni, Rebecca Hellman, Daniel Khatebe, Philo Makama, Josephine Cornell, Nezis Watiti, and more recent ones, Pascal Richardson, Oxolo Tumani, a number of others I'm not mentioning here. I want to begin a little bit what's happening and why I have these names here. That it is one thing to try to point out the problems of psychology, and there are many of these problems. The coloniality of psychology, its racism, its support for torture, its apartheid character in the last decades, number of decades in South Africa. It's one thing to point out to these problems. It's another to put up an alternative psychology, to decolonize psychology, but to use it also for anti-racist purposes. This is what we have been doing with these people I've just noted here. And Shose mentioned something else in relation to this, about institutions and statutes. Some of us are learning that since 2015, a very necessary and political act. It is one thing to bring down the statutes, as happening with the movement for Black Lives right now in the US, in the UK, in other parts of the world. And recently, the statue of Rhodes at Rhodes Memorial here on the mountain, just up the mountain. It's one thing to want to bring down and burn the old institutions and statues. It's another to build new ones. For my own work, of course, this has to do with men and masculinities. But the more you think about it, yes, it is necessary. It's a political act. It's an emancipatory act to point out the problems of masculinity and the problems in men's behavior. It's another thing to bring about new men, to raise boys to be this other egalitarian, democratic, emancipated men, if men is what you want to build. So we have been doing, trying to put up this kind of psychology, an African-centered. This is a big one for us. And it's African-centered, it's decolonized, it's decolonial, it's anti-capitalist, it's feminist, it's anti-racist, and other de-alienating approaches. And here are two things in a recent piece of work that we have done that Shanaz right at the beginning referred to. And perhaps this is at the take homes if you want that kind of thing. If embracing the way that psychology bends and contorts under the emancipatory requirements of feminism or anti-racism, of decolonization demands, of African-centeredness, if this contortion and bending gives rise to something that looks very little like psychology as we know it, then so be it. This is basically almost a motto that that one carries along as one does this work. If we're to reject psychology as an oppressive ideological apparatus, and what an apparatus it is, socially and politically progressive activity needs to guide psychology. And this is quite important, that psychology should follow rather than lead work against racial injustice, against racism. And that work is what you see on the screen, which will also show you how we are doing this work amongst ourselves, but also in putting it out. So let me cycle back before I come back to other things, that part of this work and what we're doing, you might remember last year around March, a number of us in what I call the Boswell group. Barbara Boswell is a professor of English, Dimitri Rasmus of sociology, Shahel Johansson and Shahid Mohammed, all of us came together and we had tremendous support in South Africa, but also across the world. At one point, 10,000 signatures, because we found a piece written by psychologists at the University of Stellenbosch that some of you, probably many of you know about the low cognitive function of colored women. We found this objectionable, and we wrote and we gathered signatures and we wrote to the editors. And there are other examples that Garth has already mentioned. That particular piece was underpinned by racist ideology. It was flawed methodologically. It perpetuated this amazing thing that we have in this particular country of 4 races. I mean, this is a particular moment in South Africa where we become first 3 races, by the way, with the Asian and Indians as a subcategory of the colored category, and that particular category being a negative. It's a negation. It's if you are not white and if you are not black and you're colored. Clearly that is a ridiculous category if there's one, but of course all of this categorization were the center, if you will, the epicenter of apartheid ideology. So this uncritical use of the apartheid designation colored was problematic. That the article itself reproduced harmful notions, stereotypes about coloredness. It expressed, didn't understand that race is a socio-political expression, that even when people choose this, it is unstable, it's fluid, it's political. And so we requested a retraction, And in about a month, we received favorable news from the editors. What I'm trying to point out is, as psychologists or literary scholars, as sociologists, as students, that the work against anti-racism, just as the work against anti-sexism, has to be challenged wherever it happens. It doesn't have to be in your class only. It doesn't have to be in your discipline, even if it happens outside. You will recall that in 2012, something happened in South Africa, something quite sad, that the South African security forces shot down 112 black miners employed by Lonmin, platinum mine in Marikana in the Northwest. 34 black men were killed on one day. There were 10 other men who were killed a few days before, and 78 were injured. And most of the security forces who did this killing, this massacre, were black men. The world came to see this massacre on television, as you will recall, and Cyril Ramaphosa, who's the president right now, was at the time the deputy president of South Africa and was on the board of Lonmin. He characterized the miners' demands for decent wages and improved working conditions as a dastardly criminal act that had to be met with force. For many, Ramaphosa's apology 5 years later was rather shallow. Now, this year on the 25th of May 2020, Garth has mentioned this, and I'm not going to go into detail about it. A white police officer, Derek Chauvin, publicly murdered George Floyd. I'm relaying this because I keep wondering, why did the public lynching of one black man ignite this righteous, anti-racist, moral and political outrage, yet the more numerous, the quantitatively more criminal killing of the more numerous black men did not? And we have already, Garth has touched part of this. But the simple point I want to draw from this is, if you're paying attention to the movement for Black lives, we have to learn as psychology students in South Africa, as psychologists, as healers, as teachers, as researchers, from both the sects, why one ignited such an outrage and the other, which accounted for a number of men dying, did not. And I'm not going to answer this, but I do in that particular paper, and one can go on and speculate and do research on this. But the point is that anti-racist struggle, as far as I can see, need to be expansive, need to be internationalist, and the work has to be done on an ongoing basis if it is to destroy the apparatuses through which racial injustice works, and it works to chip in and ultimately end the lives of black men, black women, and people of color all over the world. The problem we face in psychology is, of course, that we tend to treat racism and racial injustice as a matter of things such as cultural incongruence, of ignorance, and there's a lot of work around this in the archives of psychology, of personality problems, and which then we can address through diversity training. And many of you probably do this sort of work, and some of us have done this, of bringing people into contact with one another, of integration, of working on producing tolerant attitudes. What you do in that instance is, as Shose has just pointed out, ignore structural and symbolic inequalities. You also ignore capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, and how hard it is to evade it, to transcend it, even to tame it. You ignore the connection with patriarchy. You even ignore the mental health issues caused by racism. There's a whole lot of studies around this, of course. If you are doing that sort of work, you're ignoring struggle. And that's, you are not taking the risk necessary to undo racism. You think, just as in South Africa, when 1994 came that racism is dead. But we learn repeatedly, and this is again the lesson from Marikana, that anti-racism is anti-racist work. Psychology that is intersectional necessitates risk, struggle, and the message to psychology students and psychologists is that the work against racism, along with this risk, with this struggle, necessitates participating in anti-racism struggles outside of universities, outside of teaching, and that it has always been led by grassroots activism, not psychologists. Now, I already began by telling you about this literature, this work we're doing on decolonizing potential and the decolonizing potential of psychology, using psychology to decolonize. And it is happening. Some of the people who are working on this, I can see in the webinar here in South Africa, in India, in the US, in the UK, and in Latin America. And this is the work in doing anti-racist work, anti-racist psychology, you want to tap into. And that work leads to a psychology that embraces the risk then of anti-racism, which is the risk of not being faithful to methodology. And no, as psychologists, we teach students, we are taught to be faithful to the steps of doing research. And of course, in therapy, particular kinds of way of doing therapy, the word frame is a big thing among psychologists. You cannot break the frame. And there's an example here I could give in very few words, that one of our students, who I didn't mention, by the way, if she's there, Sarah Day, tells an amazing story about precisely this, that if someone comes to you and you're doing, wherever you are, you're doing your psychology work and tells you that they have been raped or that they've been savaged by a policeman, what do? Do you sit and try to counsel them, speak to them, or you take them to where they will get help that they need? And that help might include the police station. That help might include taking them to a shelter. And so this already tells you about a different kinds of psychology that is not faithful to disciplinary orthodoxy. That doesn't mean that psychologists have not been working on racism. Garth has told you about this. Shose already has just told you about the work we have been doing, she has been doing at UCT. Psychologists have worked in organizations and with groups to change, I beg your pardon, racist cultures. But some of these psychologists have been quite challenging to us, have been robust. They've told us that, that we have to recognize the challenges involved with this work, and including in teaching, that you cannot change racism only by teaching. So here's the lesson for would-be anti-racist. The lessons of anti-racism are best learned outside of the classroom, within the context of organized, intersectional, Black-led collective struggle. And this is one thing, particularly the queer, non-binary women students at UCT in 2015 were very adamant in saying that remember that there were women here and they were leading the struggle, and those women were Black, and those leaders were women. And here is the thing: when we are part of anti-racist struggles, when we're working towards anti-racist objectives, that when you are unbecoming a racist, when you are changing your attitudes, your being, the racist ego ideal becomes dismantled, not because you want to become a better person, which is always nice, but for political reasons. So the psychologist plays a role, may play a role in working with people, works to undo, to unlearn racism, to articulate it for themselves, to learn what is racism, and as well as working with others, and to construct, which is rather important, to construct this intersectional anti-racist policies, institutions, and structures. So this articulation goes beyond merely just recognizing and calling out racism. I should just give an example right here, particularly about working with others. In the recent past, beginning of July, the mayor of Cape Town, who is, I would say is a black man, but clearly he doesn't think so, or perhaps he was joking, but it doesn't look like it. And you can search this on Twitter. He said he has black friends as though they are family. And clearly you start to see that the work that psychologists have to do in changing people and changing policies, well, it doesn't really matter whether Dame Plato is and structures, so that even someone like that can go to support, or rather the structures can go to support racial justice. So what is required then is the more difficult work of rejecting and working with others against racist acts, racist thoughts and structures which hold supremacist whiteness. This is quite important. The whiteness that is problematic is the supremacist whiteness that you can see from Matteo Salvini to Donald Trump, to the neighborhood racist who talks about in where I live right now here, on the WhatsApp groups, calling people with objectionable names that some white people and some people use in South Africa to call black people. So that hold up supremacist whiteness up as an ideological standard that's Cooper, but also this comes from the work that Seth was doing well outside, well before he came into psychology in the Black consciousness movement, that psychological liberation serves as a precondition for political liberation. So you can have political liberation, but you still need the work of changing the psyche. So if psychological liberation serves as a precondition for political liberation, then anti-racism work must operate beyond politically charged moments. So we can't wait only for the kinds of epistemic racist violence that you see, that I started with, that Shose, I know it was Garth who mentioned this, that came out of UCT, and there's a recent one again about the problem that Black people are not succeeding in the US is because of their culture. And this is from a well-known scholar. So anti-racism psychology should also concern itself with the individual. Earlier on, I pointed out that the work is with structures, but that does not mean neglecting the individual and the everyday. Anti-racism demands from us then a commitment to addressing racism in our daily lives as individuals, the microaggressions, the colonial public monuments. And I've already said that after you bring them down, you have to think about new monuments if you want to bring new monuments up. The coded language, the symbolic racism. It means working as psychology students, as psychologists, as healers, as researchers, with people to acknowledge and take seriously how their personal experiences shape their identities, are shaped by history, although they are not entirely determined by it, that we can transcend them. We're always affected by where we live, how we grew up. And that is why in our country, we still hold on to this idea, this theory that there are 4 races in the world in which we live. A ridiculous idea if you step back and start to think with decolonial and anti-colonial thought. And I'm about to get to the end. Facilitators. Now, one of the things in the work we have been doing is that the more you work and challenge racism, you realize that anti-racism does not embody a fixed set of criteria. So although I will say something in the next slide, that really the idea of thinking about steps, what to do next, or just aphorisms doesn't work. That this is ongoing work. This is ongoing political, creative, artistic, practical work. It demands practical commitment. That anti-racist work that we're already doing, and you will see in that particular piece I referred to, but also in a number of works. Of course, you can find this about how we are learning with each other, in dialogue, interrupting each other with our students, both in the work on anti-racism specifically, but is always connected with anti-sexism, is connected with anti-capitalist work, that in this dialogue, this ongoing work, one is working against racism, is also working against other forms of injustice. So in the next slide, I am going to flesh out what is meant then, what I've been meaning by anti-racism, anti-racist psychology. I wish I could just open up what each one of these, and this comes out of a recent paper. So what anti-racism does, as well as what it does not do. And here it is that the more we think about it, that you cannot have, and the discipline, anti-racist psychology. That is not a field. That anti-racist psychology does not confine racism, as I said, to personality, to ignorance of people, or to the attitudes of the individual. That this happens, that people hold racist attitudes, that they act racist towards others, but you cannot stay there, even if the discipline you're in, which is psychology, is interested in the individual. That it does not perceive racism as a separate from other forms of social oppression. Queer folk, with women, with men, with gender fluid people, you start to realize how racism impacts us differently because of our embodiedness. That you cannot approach anti-racism, just as you cannot approach racism as a momentary act, that it is always demanding of us to work. Otherwise, you have precisely what happened, seems to have happened among psychologists in 1994, that racism is dead. But the more you realize that you could have, as I think it's Eduardo Bonilla, I need to be corrected here, that you can have racism without racists, that you can have racist structures, you can have symbolic racism, that anti-racism psychology does not believe racism to be of concern to some and not to others. Somehow, there are amongst us, I'm sure, who believe that this work only concerns Black people. This is not true. So what does anti-racism psychology do then? It prioritizes anti-racism over psychology. That the work against racism, for racial justice, is led not by psychologists. It is led outside, but somehow, or rather, we need to be part of this. That racism is pervasive. It surprises you. You are walking in your suburb and someone stops you and asks you what you're doing here. You are at a workplace and somebody mistakes you for an intruder. And it has happened in other parts of the world, that somehow in your own yard, the police would confront you, perhaps even shoot you. That anti-racism psychology engages the psychological, the systemic, the material as constituents of racism. That it appreciates intersections then with other social justice struggles, and considers anti-racism as a project of human development. And this is necessary to teach our children about Blackness, about racism, about how the world will look at them because of their skin color. It is about emancipating the human. I thank you. Stop there. Thank you, Fatima, Garth, Shanaz.
Thank you, Kopano. I've just been informed that Shanaz is unable to get back into the webinar, and so I have the unenviable task, colleagues and friends, of trying to moderate the next 30 minutes or so, and at the same time trying to be part of the conversation and the Q&A and so forth. So again, Kopano, thank you so much for a really fascinating input on ideas about an anti-racist praxis and what this may look like for us in psychology, but also beyond psychology. I think it's really given us food for thought. So there are a number of questions, of course, that have come up on the Q&A, and I'm not going to be able to take all of these, but I wanted to perhaps pick up on a couple that have intersected with some of the work that's been spoken about here, and really to perhaps engage Shose and to think a little bit with Shose and Kopano about what this really means. And the first one that I really want to put out there is a question that Shose is raised, and it's really about the kind of politics of emotion. And I wondered whether there was something about talking to the idea of the politics of emotion. What is important about the politics of emotion in this moment? What are the pitfalls of the politics of emotion in this moment? You spoke about the performance of poverty, for example, Shose, and I wondered if you want to elaborate on that a little further. Kopano, you're free to come into this as well.
Okay, thanks, Garth. Yeah, and I think there was one question by Frank Mugisha in the Q&A. I love that question. Maybe I can just read it quickly. Who says, what is the intersectionality of art and psychology in raising these questions and providing insights on how to tackle institutional racism and internalized racism that we continue to perpetuate as Black people? And I really like that question because I think there's a lot to be said about, moving towards an anti-racist approach that is about becoming human, and it is about healing from trauma, from the trauma of racism. And definitely, I do think that we need to be transdisciplinary in our approaches. We need to bring in the types of methods, like artistic methods, into our research projects or into any of our projects, because there's a limit in terms of how we can do that work using psychology with, I guess, traditional types of psychology. And also I'm reminded of a very beautiful piece written by Nomusa Makubu and Kessi Mbongwa, who talk about, protest action. They talk about radical love, Black love, and what all of these things mean. And one thing that struck me was when they were talking about protest activity. And I remember experiencing this during Rose Must Fall. I mean, the protest activity was very overpowering, and I guess very necessary for what we were trying to achieve at the time. But it did end up afterwards with, it did have a psychological impact on students, definitely. And I think we missed something there. It's a very harsh way to do anti-racist work. And I think that needs to be combined with other healing types of work, which are equally important and that address a different type of legacy of racism. So yeah, I really do like that question. I think it's a very important one. Thanks.
Thanks, Shose. Kopano, you want to come in at all on this?
No, I think we should move in a little bit rapidly, Garth. So I will give that a skip. Yeah.
That's fine. So I mean, one of the things that of course has come up in the Q&A chat is really this question that's been raised by yourself. I've also raised it in the opening remarks, and certainly the kind of relativism that one sees around Black Lives Mattering. When do Black Lives matter? When do they not matter? And you know, the idea that actually in Marikana you had the death of many Black men, and at the same time you see the kind of valence or the currency or the kind of traction that Black Lives Matter gets across the world amongst celebrities, amongst sports fans, and all of a sudden this generates a different kind of response to the question of Black Lives Matter. I mean, any thoughts from your side about how it is that we can think through why it is that there's a differential valuing of human life in some ways here?
So are you asking me, Garth, you know, why did this grab the imagination the way it did?
Yes.
I have put forth a number of things, and please just interject if I am my order, because I try to look at this. That if you compare what happened in Marikana, which was incredible, that that's the first thing. There was a delayed attention to it. That it came in the evening news, for instance. It came. And at a particular time, unlike what we have right now. So those are two things connected to each other. So we saw this in the films, we saw this reported, and there was that commission. But something, and then of course the mechanism of killing, that these were guns. But during this time of COVID, a number of people, the whole world is sitting at home, and you're watching this man in 8 minutes, 46 seconds or thereabout, being killed, publicly murdered, basically, by an officer of the law. Other 3 men are observing this. So we were watching, not quite almost in real time, but we were watching this. Perhaps other people in the US were watching in real time. And this is not just startling, and it's reminiscent of what Donald Trump was said, that I could walk down the street and kill somebody and nobody would do anything. And perhaps at that moment, a lot of attention is right here, and we're seeing it as it happens, and that really galvanizes that. But perhaps more than just watching this murder, is because the movement for Black Lives has been organizing since about 2015, 2012. Quite a lot. So they are doing this work that some of us that you well know, they're not just doing it in academic settings. They're working with communities. They're building collective. And of course, as you might remember, they're also going into governance. They're going into municipalities. And as it happened in the last election in the US, a lot of Black women, Muslim women, Black people step up and do this. So there was a lot of work that I already pointed out, Garth, that there is an ongoing work against racism that some of us in this country have not done. But here's a third reason that I could put up, and I've been thinking that in South Africa, there's it is arguable whether what you saw, and that creates ambivalence in it. What you saw was racist. Let me give another example right here. You don't want to. You want to take in good faith. South Africans will watch yesterday a documentary where young Black men walked into a school and shot a teacher, and this was incredible. I mean, I hadn't known about this. They shot a teacher, they stole a TV, and they laughed. And something in that video is when an official of government, a Black person, comes in and says, "It is too expensive to protect teachers." I mean, this is just incredible. And my thought, one of my questions is, I wonder whether if a person of another race, this had happened in a white school, this is what we would have said. So there is an ambivalence that's created when Black people killing other Black people, they rob them, they shoot them, but also in this valuing of life that makes us, it removes us of recognizing that this has something to do with how we value life, with racism. But, and I'm not supporting one political party, that you start to realize that what happened in Marikana, the economic injustice of it is connected to how much you value people's labor. That the miners who are Black do not deserve as much money as other laborers in Australia, as white laborers. In fact, Longmin says exactly this. This is incredible. So this valuing of different lives is part of what you saw in relation to what happened to George Floyd, as opposed to some of the things, many of the things that's been happening in South Africa.
Thanks, Kopano. Shose, you wanted to come in on that at all?
No, I'm good, thanks, Garth.
Okay. So one of the questions that's also been asked, of course, is on the chat and in the Q&A is really what do we do around this? And I'm also aware that there are a number of practitioners in the room, and I'm talking about the virtual room here. And I did want to point out that there's a fair amount of work that is resurging in the area of psychotherapeutics, for example, and race. And I think that there's a significant, so practitioners often ask the question, what is it that we can do? What is it that we should do, given that we don't necessarily work in the kind of context that some of you work in? And one of my responses to them is that actually race is always present. It may not always be salient, but race is always present. Gender is always present. It may not always be salient, but it's always present. And so there's a huge amount of work for practitioners who are interested to certainly be thinking about race in the clinical dyad, for example, or in the group setting, or in any of the therapeutic work that they do. And I mentioned this earlier on, that as we've had the turn towards affect, a lot of people working on questions of shame, a lot of people working on questions of envy, on guilt, on complicity, on rage. And this is partly to understand the kind of social sequelae of race and racism. But at the same time, this work can be translated into work inside the therapeutic space as well. And I would really encourage people to go and look at the work of Julia Christopher, if you're interested. Go and look at the work of Fakhri Davids. Go and look at the work of Dalal. Go and look at the work of Leighton, and so on. There was a question on the group, on the chat, as well as in the Q&A, about the kind of racialized nature of the content of psychological discourse and training and so on. I think that's absolutely correct. The specific question was related to Jung's work, for example. And I think it's absolutely correct to be thinking through how it is that some of the texts that we've been exposed to as core text, as part of the psychological canon, so to speak, are themselves implicated in the reproduction of race, in the reproduction of racism. And so yes, I mean, the point is very well made that that much of the work that we see in Jung's early writings on primitive states and so on, we would certainly consider to be racialized and deeply racialized. Part of the task for us, and I think this connects to something you were saying, Shose, is really to think about student experience and also to think about the way in which people are trained and taught. And I wondered whether you had a thought or any further thoughts on what it is that we're needing to do inside classrooms to ameliorate and attenuate some of the experiences that you referenced around Black students in particular, and the way that they enter spaces that may not be numerically white, but actually in terms of their structure, their practice, their process, their content, actually represent the kind of racialization that's precisely part of the problem that we're talking about here. Any thoughts from your side, children?
Yeah, thanks, Garth, for that question. I think there's some immediate things, that we can do, and one of them is really thinking carefully about the curriculum, because that is what students are to do at university, is to learn and to read, and so the curriculum, I think there are easy ways in which it can be changed. Of course, in the long term, we need new textbooks, we need new books, and that takes time. But there are easy ways in which teachers can bring in examples from real life experience into their teaching. They can bring in, scholars from the continent into their teaching. there are many ways in which we can modify our teaching practices to make the space more inclusive, for lack of a better word. And I think, Garth, there are some questions here related to that. I don't know if I can find them now because there's quite a long list, but Sue Black was asking about teaching practices and what teachers can do. And I think, yes, it's partly about the content is what is taught. But when I was thinking about the group work example that I gave in my presentation, I think it's not about, the solution is not to remove group work, but it's to do it in a very, is to think through it carefully and to plan it carefully. And so to think about how is the work distributed amongst the students in the group. Maybe to have some reflection on their experience of the group work afterwards, so that some of the issues that they are experiences can actually become part of the teaching, part of the learning experience, and how they can reflect on that. And then there was a question by Vanessa Cross, I think, about how students in the university feel about being evaluated in texts and exam. I think that's another area. I mean, and it's about developing, I suppose it's about how students trust the assessment process and who's assessing their work. And I know that a lot of students feel like they're being marked down because maybe because they're English or because for whatever reason. And there was actually a story in one of the focus groups that I ran where students said to me, you know, I got the best mark in my class for a particular assignment. And then the white students in the class were saying there must be something wrong with this assignment. So I think there is, and that will depend on, you know, what is the content. If suddenly the content of what is being examined has something to do with my experience and my life, and then I can relate to it better, I will perform better in whatever I'm doing. Yeah, and I think there was a general question again from Vanessa Cross about how individuals and collectives can challenge these deep-seated ideologies of institutions. And I think that is similar to the question you're asking, Garth. And in my experience, there are ways of doing it in insider resistance types of ways. You know, at the UCT, we have the Black Academic Caucus, which is a group of Black academics. We have other staff organizations as well, I think, that have been quite effective in influencing policy and change at the university. Of course, the difficulty also similar to what students have experienced is that when you organize and you start doing this anti-racist work, the pushback is so harsh, and you have to survive that pushback is very difficult because, you know, we've seen in the recent public media discourses how the Black Academic Caucus is being, referred to as the Broederbond. And, you know, for many people, those accusations are deeply hurtful. And so, because it's part of that historical trauma that I was talking about before. And so to stay in, to do this kind of anti-racist work, I think, of course, it's necessary to collaborate with others because you need a network of support to do it, but it has to go beyond an institution. I mean, we need to have Black caucuses, I think, in all our institutions, and we probably need to have a national Black caucus of academics. And we need to have relationships with other academic groupings of staff, you know, or other organizations that do this kind of work. So, yeah, it's definitely not an easy easy task. And it will take a lot of thinking, of organization, and of resilience.
Thanks, Shose. Kopano, anything from your side? I do have a question that's kind of come up here in different ways on the Q&A, and it's really speaking to the matter of solidarity. And I think it speaks in some ways to your work on anti-racist praxis and how it is that we think about solidarities and at the same time consider the particularities of our particular context. So how is it that you maintain and keep an eye on the ball, so to speak, on what it is that is happening in a country like South Africa, but at the same time, how is it that one forges solidarities with groups in North America or in Latin America or in Southeast Asia or in the Middle East, where questions of the kind of attacks on minorities of color in particular are repeatedly exercised and enacted on a day-to-day basis. Your thoughts on a kind of a politics of solidarity that sits inside and outside of psychology, yeah? Kopano, are you with us?
Yes, your either it's mine or yours. Some parts of this I didn't hear, but I heard the part around the politics of solidarity. Do you want to finish that thought for me?
So really just to think a little bit about what a politics of solidarity would look like, where we take into account both the particularities of our context and at the same time engage in reciprocal, mutually supportive work with those who find themselves in similar kinds of positions in different parts of the world.
Okay, thanks, Garth. I mean, to begin with, this moment that we're experiencing globally has brought onto the table precisely these kinds of work around the need for solidarity. And my colleagues here have been incredible. I'm sure a lot of people have been doing this work. This work demands not just us to work as psychologists offering all kinds of help, but also as citizens in particular spaces, as people, as humans. And then when you realize that other parts of the world are experiencing this, that you extend whatever kinds of practical solidarity. And this really has been great in so to speak, in beginning to think about, and for all the psychology students and psychologists out there, the moment you realize that you're not an essential service, that some psychologists are not essential services, that the people have more elementary, more immediate needs, like food, like shelter, and in that particular condition, in those circumstances, what is your work? You might remember, I don't know whether he's in this webinar, Ian Parker talking about this, that he goes to his students and they got PhDs and they're building houses, and other people asking them, what can we do as psychologists? No, we don't need psychologists. We're building houses right here. So in that particular moment, that the particularity of the situation demands to learn what's happening in India, people having to walk kilometers and then dying on the road. What happens right now in Hong Kong, what happens in the US. And of course, social media becomes a really amazing space in that one sense. So what's been happening in a practical sense is, you extend the spaces that you already, Shose mentioned, a student of ours, that the moment you start thinking of space, that what happens in space, in a context, that the work you do can be, enlarged, and you connect with the other spaces, either in Kansas, either in India, and this space are enlarged and become global. Garth, if you allow me, there are practical things that I just perhaps want to say in the last few minutes about what somebody like Kim Robinson has asked, and I think Cindy Lee Norman has also asked, but a number of people, and Fatima has said this, and Shanaz, that this work, or this has been recorded, so it'll be available. that we are putting in practical terms resources on writing around racism. That's another thing. So that answers that work. So I don't need to share Kim Robinson, I don't need to share the slide. It'll be there, but also that the emails of the people are available, then we can address. I mean, it's 72 questions or comments now in the Q&A, so we can't really address all of them. But can I take two quick ones here? One from, can you, and somebody like Ntsiki Dumel has also asked, and Annalisa Ventura, can you put up the references that Garth that you mentioned? And we might do this, we can return to this. And the last thing from me really is about, Pervais Khan has asked, does that mean then black poor lives do not matter in South Africa? And the simple answer is yes. I mean, we value lives differently. And in a capitalist society, we value people because they have money. It's the most ridiculous thing. But this is what capitalism, in the midst of plenty, you have poverty. This is the problem of capitalism, of neoliberal capitalism, that we value people because they earn $1 million rand, they drive, Porsches, and racism has to work with this. That's the part where intersectionality opens up to show that you cannot just work on anti-racism as psychologists. You have to work with these other forms of injustice.
Great, thanks, Kopano. Shose, anything from your side? Any last comments? I'm noticing that we're getting to the point of 2 o'clock, and I'm wanting to give you each an opportunity to make any last closing comments that you have not yet had an opportunity to make. I think that obviously there have been many questions, and I'm sorry that we are not able to take all of these right now. I see the call for additional webinars of this nature and extended opportunities to engage, and we'll certainly follow that up. But Shose, any last questions or comments from you?
Yeah, thanks, Garth. I wanted to say something about whiteness, because I think there's been a lot of we haven't really spoken about it, but just to say briefly, absolutely, it's absolutely important to engage in critical whiteness reflections and the role of whiteness in anti-racist strategies. And of course, fundamentally, we are Black because they are white people. People are white because they are Black people. We don't exist outside of each other. So, of course, this dialogue is absolutely critical in terms of advancing an anti-racist discourse. I want to end with just a few thoughts about psychology. And I think from what we've been talking about today, what came up quite clearly for me is that the need to think on an advanced psychology in more decolonial approaches to the psychology of racism. And by that, I mean, admitting, surfacing the global dynamics of power that exist. Like what Kopano has just said, that racism is linked to gender discrimination, it's linked to class discrimination. It's very difficult to talk about these things separately and to admit that, the global environment in which we live in is a hetero-patriarchal capitalist society. And so these things intersect, and that's why, things like Black Lives Matter is very important, because it's an example of a global form of solidarity. It's not the only one, but it's one example. And I do think that also as part of a decolonial approach is this idea of decolonial love. How do we work towards healing from trauma? How do we work towards just becoming human? So those, I think, are my final thoughts, Garth. Thank you.
You want me to jump in, Garth?
Yes, please, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Garth. I think perhaps one thing that's folding in it another. I've been rereading it, like most of us doing decolonial work. Somebody like Ngugi, he doesn't say this in particular, but in the chapter on African fiction, for instance. On fiction, he asked this particular question, and I think a number of you might know about who am I doing this work for? I mean, who am I writing for? Who am I teaching for? I mean, if you're teaching for your students, perhaps. And that has reminded me, I mean, it settles this particular, that you can build an anti-racist, anti-sexist, egalitarian space where you work, whether this is a university, whether it's in your practice, that this space is egalitarian. And what is possible then? I mean, is this possible? Is this possible to make this country, this space, perhaps even the world, egalitarian? I mean, the more, and I work on this question of equality. What is to be equal? How do you generate this equality, both with my students and colleagues, but also organizations outside, well outside? And it every time we go back to it, and I realize that, you know, even when you want to lose hope, the limits of what is possible are generated by what you believe in, whether you think it is possible to have an equal society. And I think we can, an anti-racist, equal society, and you have to work. So this is really the zone of psychologists. This is the one part psychology really does, to work on beliefs, to work on norms and changing them. And it is possible by starting to create the zones of freedom, if you will. This is Fanon again, right? To create this. And what I see really, even in the midst of despair, the work we're doing with students, white students, black students, about the possibilities of doing a different psychology, of an equal world, of a different kind of inhabiting what we call white bodies. Last thing, Garth, it wasn't part of this idea about whiteness. I'm glad that Shose has touched on it. Quick story. In 1965, a white man dies in Durban, kills himself because he was arrested. Why was he arrested? Because he had sex with a black person. This is the most ridiculous thing if you start to imagine about it, that you can have a whiteness killing white people. You can have a whiteness like that. Thanks, Garth. We all stuck?
I think, Garth, your mic is muted.
Garth, can you unmute your mic?
Unmuted, thank you. So thank you, Kopano, thank you, Shose. I think that maybe one last comment from me, and that is that one of the things that I think is going to be important as we rethink and recalibrate the psychology is really a psychology of the differential value of human life. I think any anti-racist work has got to be looking at the psychology of how we value human life. And I want to make the point that any life worth saving has to be a life that is worth living in the first place. Any life that can be killed can only be killed, of course, when it is considered to be something that is less than human or non-human. And any life that needs to be mourned is one that in the first place has to be grievable. And I think that this is central to the way that forms of marginalization, and in this instance race as well, starts to work and becomes enabled in a context where hierarchies of value are attached to different lives. So I'm going to leave it there from my side. I think two last matters to raise is just that the resources, or many of the resources that we've spoken about, have already been posted on the PsySSA website. Please do have a look at that. Please also fill out the, I think I'm being asked to just let you know that you should please fill out the evaluation. There's also a link that I think will be posted for CPD. And if there are any questions that you have, please do feel free to contact the PsySSA office. I want to take this opportunity once more to just extend my thanks to Professor Shose Kessi, to Professor Kopano Ratele for the excellent presentations. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. Thank you for your insights, for your experience, for your thoughtful inputs. It's really been wonderful to be in conversation with you this afternoon. We certainly will be looking to do this again. I also want to thank all of you, the many hundreds of you who joined here today. It was great to see the kind of traction that this event got, and really to thank you all for taking the time to spend 2 hours with us and just to be in conversation with us, even though this is only virtual. We will certainly be hosting additional webinars on this topic and on additional topics. Please remember that, of course, PsySSA is not hosting the annual Congress this year, and in lieu of that, we're going to be doing many, many more of these over the coming months. I also want to extend my thanks to the PsySSA office, in particular Fatima, Mohammed, for assisting, for setting this up. Again, it's been great. I know that there are always technical difficulties, but thank you so much for accommodating just under 3,000 people who were registered for this webinar today. Really, really appreciate all the work that has gone into this. And then I know that Shanaz has been on and off and has not necessarily been able to stay with us, but thank you, Shanaz, for agreeing to facilitate and really stepping at the last minute when we had some challenges with who was going to be participating and not participating. Much appreciated. And to all of you, again, a huge, huge thank you. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us, and we'll see you at the next webinar.